ecosystems. This might sound like a business school trend fashion, but I think it's more, and it's very important for people in tech. And especially, I'm interested in the role of the university. So, as I didn't hear the introduction, but I'm sure you already told people that I started off from tech, that I did my early degree in computer science, but now switched and moved on, but didn't switch to something totally different. But I will show you how my current work and my current research links. So what I'm interested in research is innovation. And my interest was always how to drive innovation with technology, how to drive innovation with IT, with digitization, how markets and organizations would change when digitization comes in. And so in recent years, I was mainly focusing on open innovation, on free innovation, and on the question how platforms, digital platforms, also allow for new organizational forms like innovation ecosystems. Well, and then a few years ago, I was invited to become a vice president of my university, Friedrich-Alexander Universität, Erlangen-Nürnberg. And I first thought it might kick me out of my research life. But then it turned out there is a very good way to combine, because starting at FAU, here you see the very historic building where we are sitting in Erlangen. My business school is in Nuremberg. And quickly, we were somehow ranked as #1 innovator. So for sure, each university has a ranking that pleases. But for us, it was really cool to see that in the ranking of the most innovative universities of this world, somehow FAU made it to #1 in Germany, #2 in Europe, and #14 in the world, which is cool. But we are not so much interested in the ranking. We are more interested in why we are so innovative and how we can help our region, our economy, our partners with this innovation power, and how do they help us. So with this in mind, I started to focus more um, to understand innovation ecosystems. So the ecosystems that are driven by players, by institutions in usually a region. And when you think of an innovation ecosystem, you might think of the usual ones. And you might think of those around the universities that were just listed on my last slide. But it's much less clear what role universities play in those ecosystems. So when we think of ecosystems, we often first look at business ecosystems, so driven by companies. This is just a picture that I've taken from an article that I really like, which describes Amazon as a complex ecosystem, not a company. And I think this is a way we could describe many of the big platform players, that they are enabling ecosystems. But it's very much driven by the single strategy of a major industrial player. And that's very different for universities. So in our group, we did some research and tried to do some gardening in the ecosystems landscape, so understand the literature. Do we really need ecosystems? Are they really different of what we had so far? We all know corporations and what we can do with them. We know markets, we know networks of institutions, communities of institutions, clusters, and now ecosystems. So what's in and what makes them different? We are also interested in how much any of those organizations enables transactions, very efficient exchange of goods and services, and which organizations really support innovation. And then we looked at how value is created and value is captured in those institutions. And we noticed we have to dig a bit deeper on how ecosystems and platforms interact. Well, business ecosystems versus knowledge ecosystems. I already mentioned it, and I think it makes a major difference. And if we get that at the end of my talk, I think then we have a quite good understanding how your own institutes, how your own universities act as drivers of ecosystems, especially of innovation ecosystems. And university ecosystems, let me say that already now, often represent a mixed mode. Well, let's look at very boring textbook stuff, but that's a foundation in research that really helps us to understand ecosystems. Yes, we have corporations, and whenever we want to get things done, the best thing is to build a new organization, a new corporation, startups. So you have a cool idea, you have a new technology, you want to bring it to the market. What do? You build a new organization, a startup that will grow and might become a big organization. If you are mainly interested in transactions, then you would either establish a market or go to a marketplace. If you are already an organization and want to interact with others, and if you want to share risk with others because the environment is so totally risky and technology changes a lot, then institutions usually start to build networks. And the idea of strategic networks emerged in the 1980s as a really big own concept, and companies changed a lot since that time, and also organizations and regions. But networks are based on very formal contracts between the players usually. And so as a next development, communities between organizations became more and more attractive and more common. In a community, an institution would attract and bundle like-minded actors. Hey, that's what we do in academia anyway, but we can also attract and bundle like-minded actors across different domains, across different disciplines, and across the boundaries of our university or our institute. And then also politicians started to focus on clusters. For sure, there have always been clusters in history, but they noticed, hey, maybe it's clusters that help us to drive innovation. And in fact, clusters unite actors under shared objectives. So we are here in the so-called medical valley. Everyone with an interest in medical technology is part of that cluster. But they are usually very focused on a shared objective. And I think this is why innovation needed a more open organizational form, a more open form of governance. And this is what really brought ecosystem to the front stage in recent years. Because ecosystems, we could say they are institutions that curate and develop shared intentions. That sounds a big business school-like again, but it also tells us that very different types of organizations with a shared intention can join in, and innovation is behind those types of ecosystems. Well, now you can imagine building an ecosystem is not something that you do overnight. So you might to create a startup quickly. And all our institutions are very good in driving an entrepreneurial scene all around us. Just yesterday, former students of ours who have even worked for my chair a few years ago, then started their startup in a few years ago, then were in our tech incubator, Zollhof, then got about 20 million funding, and yesterday they got 60 million US dollar on top. So this is something that can happen, and we all know that very quickly. But ecosystems take a little while. So if we look at the development from the birth of an ecosystem to its maturation, you see here that it first starts with very low value, and then you have to work very hard to create value, but it can be quite fast because you bring together institutions from different domains, from different industries, even from industries and academia. You bring them together, they share common intentions and interest, and they create value. And at some point, there's a saturation of the value they can create. That's interesting so far. And many governments think, oh, let's invest in ecosystems. And I could give you many case studies, but let me just give one case example. As we have already seen a drone earlier in a video today, the Danish government once had the great idea to drive a drone ecosystem. So they have drone manufacturers, drone startups, so drone ecosystem, that was their big dream. And they started and they invested, and the government invested, and a lot happened. And after 16 years of huge investment, they thought, maybe now it's time to let it grow on its own, and it might be self-sustained now. And then they did some research, and what turned out is that basically the 16 years covered a space that's a little bit like this gray triangle here. So still very much in the early phase of an ecosystem. So if you look at not just the value creation, but the potential to capture the value, hey, you have to invest a minimum another 30 years to make it happen. So ecosystems are not something that you would establish overnight, but it's something that with a real long-term perspective can create very big value, not just create, but also allow for value capture. And that's what's really important and what my colleagues described in a really interesting paper last year. Well, if from that we move on and think, okay, but we see platforms driving ecosystems around the globe. We think of the platform businesses, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazon, and so on. So all those platforms somehow drive ecosystems, and this didn't take centuries. So maybe we have to better understand how platforms and ecosystems interact, and whether there's a real distinction, and how platforms can help us to drive ecosystems. That's another paper that great colleagues of mine have published last year. And I especially like, from the deep discussion that they did, this very simple 4-square map, where they distinguish that there can be platforms with and without ecosystems, and there can be ecosystems with and without platforms. First key learning. And well, also from the literature, we know that ecosystems profit a lot from complementarity. So when complementary things come together from different industries, from different organizations. So you might think of a tennis racket and a tennis ball as being complementary. Isn't that great? Isn't that complementary? But sorry, I have to disappoint you. The combination of a tennis racket and a ball is great for doing sports, but it's neither a platform for more, nor is it creating or driving an ecosystem or being an ecosystem in itself. But the same would be true if you go to an Apple store. It's basically a store. It's a cool store, yes. It's a slightly different store, yes. But it's not a platform on which you would build your own business, your own ideas, your own future. And it's not an ecosystem where really partners interact and drive activities and profit from complementarities. But so my colleagues distinguished and said, yes, there are also platforms without ecosystems that are highly valuable. Think of Airbnb, think of Uber, or simply think of the Apple App Store. That's also a store, but it's a digital one, and it's a platform. People join in, and the platform profits from the complementary actors and activities joining. So I bring in my tiny little flat, you bring in your villa on Airbnb, and then Airbnb as a platform can really scale up and profit a lot from the complementary input of different players who feel attracted to that. Same for Uber and same for the Apple App Store, as we all know. But still, not an ecosystem. So I might rent out my flat, I might drive a car, but it's not creating more between the different players. It's just a platform. It's not an ecosystem. If we move up to the ecosystems world, they would point us to solar photovoltaic systems as a real good case of an ecosystem without a platform. We don't need a platform, but there are many players in the photovoltaic industries that produce complementary products and services, and together they interact heavily and create something bigger and this is growing and self-sustaining and growing, this is an ecosystem without a platform. And they would also classify Apple iTunes as an ecosystem without a platform. And if you use Apple iTunes, you have an understanding of what they mean, an ecosystem that profits from complementarities, but not yet an ecosystem driven by a platform. And they would move on and say Apple iOS, PlayStation, 5G, the IoT world. Here we find ecosystems that are supported by a platform. So there is a platform, there might be a platform strategy, how it's step by step the platform is further developed. And on that platform, a big ecosystem can grow because complementary players interact and drive it. And then you could start to think about what does it mean in my world? And this is what we did at our university. So we said, what does it mean in our world? Sorry. And we said, yes, for sure, we have things that are nicer platforms in our ecosystems. A lecture hall. A lecture hall is a nice room, and I see the lecture hall on your lecture hall on my screen, which is cool. But it's neither an ecosystem nor a platform. But if you think of your university video portal, and we did that of our FAU video portal, you notice it's a platform, and many different players from different disciplines in our university upload their videos, their teaching videos, their keynotes, and this becomes a platform and is a platform where superior value is created by the combination of complementary assets. Well, now let's move up. Where would we see ecosystems in a very simple way? If you think of your university study programs, we have 263 study programs, and we don't know whether this is too much or not enough. But what we know exactly is that this whole garden or zoo full of study programs is an ecosystem without a platform. And maybe it would need a platform, but so far it's an ecosystem without a platform. There are all these different study programs. We profit from each other. We even share, we combine, we make it more interesting for our students by having them bridge between the study programs, by linking between them. So it's a bit like the photovoltaic systems. And then finally, a platform with an ecosystem. You could think of your university's entrepreneurship center. We were thinking of our FAU Zollhof. Zollhof is our tech incubator, our entrepreneurship center. This is a platform that creates and grows and drives an ecosystem. And for sure, that's something that can speed up to some degree. I hope this makes sense so far, because I cannot see your faces. I cannot see whether you are now totally desperate, because this is about making technology grow in our economy, but less about the technology itself, or whether it makes sense to you. But we will see from the questions a little later. Well, as I said in the beginning, I am mainly interested in innovation ecosystems, because ecosystems can drive a business, they can drive pure money making, but they can also drive innovation. And innovation ecosystems are first and foremost ecosystems, with and without a platform, and we have to keep that in mind. Both types exist. Now, let me move on and let's come back to this original picture. If we look at these organizational forms and we try to understand coordination mechanisms, so how are the different types, how we can organize in our society, in our economy, how are they coordinated? This is a key question in the domain of information systems, of business school, of business development, of entrepreneurship. And in fact, early on, people were just talking about the coordination in corporations, about hierarchy, and the coordination in markets, about the price mechanisms and spot market contracts. And people like Coase or Williamson later, they all got Nobel Prizes for their discussions about the coordination in those forms and why we need both of them. And this was further developed to How get networks coordinated by stable contracts? How get communities coordinated a lot by mutual trust and shared interest? How get, and so on. And innovation systems, as I already tried to point out, research agrees that they are mainly coordinated by complementarities. So great complementary assets, people, things coming together, and that's important, distributed governance. And distributed governance, where there's not a single boss, a single strategy, a one-man show that tells the world what to do, but distributed governance and the openness to deal with distributed strategies, with a diversity of strategies, that's often a bit hard to understand for companies. It's also hard to understand for some universities, but many of our institutions are very good in that. And especially European universities are still a lot driven by the decentralized, distributed strategies of their research groups, of their faculties, of the different units. In German universities, we usually know that it's totally hopeless if you have a leadership team or a president who says, hey, we all run in this direction. Usually no one will follow because we have freedom. At FAU, we call our university a platform for freedom, and we want to be a platform for freedom. So we want to curate for this distributed strategies, governance, and really allow diversity and complementarities. And this is something that you can see in many, or will find in many, if not most, innovation ecosystems, because this is what drives an ecosystem. It's not the major funding coming from a government with a clear intention to build an ecosystem. That will only work if in the end you curate for complementarities and the diversity of distributed governance. So let's bring things together. An innovation ecosystem can be defined by understanding ecosystems in general and platforms in general. From platforms, we learned they support complementarities and they support distributed governance, among others, and innovation systems, ecosystems built on both those characteristics. And in the ecosystems world, we distinguish between business ecosystems, very much driven from a single organization's viewpoint, the Amazon ecosystem, driven by the Amazon dominant strategy, the Google ecosystem, driven by the dominant Google strategy, or the knowledge ecosystems of a university that allows for broad freedom and for a range of strategies that get integrated in the overall activities. And while business ecosystems build a lot on complementarities and often try to integrate distributed governance in order to flourish, knowledge ecosystems usually start with very strong distributed governance, and if they manage to integrate complementarities, then they have a good chance to drive an innovation ecosystem. So much, I think, for the theory. Now, if we say, how can we boost an innovation ecosystem? We already understood that it's not just about a government intention or money. It's a lot about orchestration. And yes, this orchestration profits from upfront investment. So money in the beginning, you remember this curve that we had, helps, but it's not the single driver that could make it happen. Similarly important is a long-term engagement. So don't think that the game is over in 16 years. It's always a long-term decision. Second, it's all about openness beyond your organizational boundaries, beyond your discipline, beyond your organization culture. And that's really hard to deal with. And often we are not used to really be open to work with other disciplines, with other cultures, with other, we talk about it a lot, but when we really want to make things happen and our colleagues from the other department, they are so complicated because they are either so slow or much too fast, or they are talking just business school blah blah, or they are just deep in technology, then we notice how hard it is to realize this openness that is a core ingredient to boost an innovation ecosystem. Then for sure, an ecosystem has to be attractive. If it's not attractive, people and institutions will not join. If they don't join, it won't happen. And this attraction can be based on diversity that makes institutions and regions really attractive, on heterogeneity and perceived coincidence. So if people have the impression, hey, and see and feel things are happening, there are great surprises happening. There are constantly surprises because people from different backgrounds meet, organizations cooperate that you would have never expected to cooperate, then an ecosystem gets really attractive. And then finally, co-creation happens with real sustainable and balanced competition and commitment. Well, we talked about the what, the how, and for sure we have to think about who are the players. I was so much talking about the different types of players and how different they are, but we didn't talk about what types of players I have in mind. And in an innovation ecosystem, you have a minimum of 5 different types of stakeholders. So corporations, yes, big ones and startups and so on. So we have here the corporations and the startups, minimum the big and the small. In Germany, the small and medium-sized also matter a lot. But you also have to deal with government agencies, with governments, with public institutions. You need investors, sponsors. Try not to be dependent of a single investor or a single government to invest in an ecosystem. That makes highly dependent. Always keep in mind it's about distributed decision making, diversity, even for the money inflow. And last but definitely not least, universities. And I would say universities have the biggest role when it comes to creating an innovation ecosystem, because they are the only institutions, at least in our European world, that can really deal with this openness, with this multifacetedness, and so on. And I still like the very, very early quote by Herbert Simon, who said, it's always very much like mixing oil with water. And this also applies to ecosystems. You need an orchestrator who is able to constantly mix oil with water, because otherwise the institutions would separate and go in their own separate directions. So we know, I've now understood the innovation ecosystems in a nutshell, the what, the who, the how, and the who was what we were really focusing on, and the role of the university. Now I want to give you a new example. On October 1st, Siemens launched worldwide their so-called Siemens Research and Innovation Ecosystems. And you might want to look at the link ecosystem.siemens.com, and then you will see it. What did Siemens do? Siemens, for a while, were looking at how ecosystems, how platforms work, trying to understand everything that we had just discussed. And for sure, in the beginning, also we're discussing, should we follow or copy the model of those big single-minded, single-strategy ecosystem players? And they decided for a really different way. They decided much more for the knowledge ecosystem strategy by selecting university-driven ecosystems. So they looked worldwide and selected 16 ecosystems. They call it research and innovation ecosystems. And they defined that for them, each of those research and innovation ecosystems has to have a lead university. So they truly acknowledged the huge impact that a university has as an orchestrator. So basically, they decided for university partners worldwide whom they trusted or trust to drive an innovation ecosystem and deal with everything that we just discussed and described. And here you see the players. So in the Bay Area, you see Berkeley is a traditional partner. They are always working for sure with MIT and the Greater Boston area, with the Oxbridge institutions and so on. And for sure, I wouldn't tell the story if FAU would not also be a lead university. But the great thing is, there's not one, there are many. There are 16 research and innovation ecosystems around the globe. And now Siemens is really taking a step back, and that's a really innovative strategy and makes it interesting as a case, because they allow the lead universities to take the lead in their research and innovation ecosystem, forge their strategies, work with their partners, curate the diversity, the openness in their ecosystem. And they only help, and that's really important, to create more attractiveness by opening doors between those ecosystems. For sure, many universities in the setting already cooperated before, but it gets more attractive even for our students. It gets more attractive for the companies in the innovation ecosystem. It gets more attractive for the government agencies in the innovation ecosystems if suddenly you become part of such a big setting of research and innovation ecosystems, all following the knowledge ecosystem understanding. And this is basically what I wanted to show you as a big example of a global player who decided to follow the model of a university-driven innovation ecosystem strategy. And at FAU, this is basically the game that we are playing since we were founded, but even more since our partners were all founded. So if you would come to Erlangen-Nürnberg, for sure, you meet the usual ones, the Siemens, the Healthineers, Adidas, Fraunhofer, but also the museums and so on and so on. And they all play with each other. So they all work with the university, but what's more important, together with us, they all establish platforms, smaller kind of platforms, for as a certain playground for actors to interact, to co-create, to work on growing this innovation ecosystem. And this is where I would like to stop, and I will send you the handout with some references and for sure my contact details. And I want to make sure that we have a few minutes for discussion. Thank you very much.
Kathrin, you hear that we have real clapping hands, so it's not really made up, yeah. So,
thank you, it's the real thing.
Thanks a lot for an interesting insight. I can say that what Siemens started to do is very valuable. We know it from US companies that have done this ecosystem-based thoughts, or they were driving it for many years, and they are still doing it, and partially they are extremely successful. Is there any question from the audience or virtual audience? Any virtual question? I always have someone in our audience who will definitely ask a question. I'm looking at him now. So, Stefan?
Stefan, don't worry. I think the great thing about an innovation ecosystem is that everyone can join, can come, can visit. And Ahmed, as we are linked in other contexts and hopefully see each other soon, I think we will find many ways to connect between our ecosystem.
Yeah. So Stefan, he already started his startup, and I know that he's very innovative, but he cannot turn on the microphone. Seems
I'm not innovative.
Yeah. So
Stop. It's turned on.
It's turned on.
Okay.
Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Okay.
Please,
Thank you for the talk. So, in your opinion, you say role of the university. Do you have any experience how big difference is the role of universities different European countries? Because I do have a feeling that somehow maybe in Germany, universities are a little bit more interested, for instance, in startup perspective than in let's say, several other European countries, even close by
you
countries.
can name them.
I cannot name names.
Yeah, okay.
But let's say Netherlands, I do have a feeling that there, while everyone will say, at least on a base level, of course, we are interested, but I do see there is quite a lot of struggle to get something from the university. So on a nominal level, everyone is interested, but in reality, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I would say in Europe, the real richness of Europe is, again, its diversity. And European countries have very different strengths. Our huge weakness, in my view, is that we tend to all look, especially in academia,
Do you want
to
to
the
ask?
US or to Asia. And we know much more about what's happening there than we know about our neighbor countries. So I'm currently a great admirer and fan of this European University Initiative. And I know that TU Darmstadt is also part of a European university. We are part of a European university. And in our European university, we work with Madrid, with Paris, with Budapest, Bucharest, Istanbul, Pisa, and they all are very different. Some have inspiring ideas about supporting entrepreneurs. Others are much stronger in working with EU funding. Others are much stronger in connecting. So I think they see our German strengths much more in connecting industry and university. That's something that the outside world would attribute at least to our university a lot. And by working with them, we learn again how we can combine complementarities. And that's important in order to grow. So it's not important that we all do the same equally well. What really matters is that we combine our different strengths and value our different strengths. So not a direct answer to your question, but hopefully one that helps us to move forward from where we are.
Thank you.
And now I have to be totally impolite because I have to be on the next stage at noon.
Okay, so I already know that and recognize that the time is getting very tight for you. Thanks a lot again for insights, and I think it's very interesting for those people who really want to create startups and drive innovations. Thanks again, and we clap again.
I clap for you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. So
great